Welcome to this series of talks on teaching children to read. In this series, I'm going to address each of the components of reading instruction. I'm going to explain some egregious ways in which current reading instruction goes terribly, terribly wrong, and explain how we actually should be going about this task. Okay. For all children, but especially for the one for whom learning to read is going to be difficult, early learning must be a safe and joyful experience. Many of our students in this land, in which nearly a third of students live in dire poverty, despite the wealth of the country, many of those students come to school not ready, physically or emotionally or linguistically, for the experience of learning to read. They have spent their short lives hungry and or abused. They lack proper eyeglasses. They have had caretakers who didn't take care because they were constantly teetering on one precipice or another, often as a result of our profoundly inequitable economic system, but also as a result of problems like alcohol or drug addiction. Many of the students coming into our school have almost never had an actual conversation with an adult. They are barely articulate in the spoken language and thus not ready to comprehend written language, which is merely a means for encoding a spoken one. They haven't been read to. They haven't put on skits for mom and dad and the grandparents. They don't have a bookcase in their room, if they have a room, brimming with Goodnight Moon, A Snowy Day, Redfish, Bluefish, Thomas the Tank Engine, The Illustrated Mother Goose, and Deleuze's Book of Greek Myths. They haven't learned to associate physical books with joy and closeness to people who love them. In the ambient linguistic environment in which they reach school age, they have heard millions fewer total words and tens of thousands fewer unique lexemes than have kids from more privileged homes. And they have been exposed to much less sophisticated syntax. Some, when they have been spoken to at all by adults, have been spoken to mostly in imperatives. Stop that. I told you to stop doing that or you'll get a spanking. Go outside and play. Compare the middle class. See the leaves? Funny looking, huh? This is called a ginkgo tree. Can you say ginkgo? Great. These trees come all the way from China. Did you know that? Which is all the way on the other side of the whole wide world. Children from low positive stimulus homes desperately need compensatory environments in which spoken interactions and reading are rich, rewarding, joyful experiences. If a child is going to learn to read with comprehension, he or she must be ready to do so, physically, emotionally, and linguistically, having become reasonably articulate already in a spoken language. Learning to read will be difficult for many kids, easy for others, and often the difficulty will have nothing to do with brain wiring and everything to do with the experience that the child has had in his or her short life. In this, as well as in brain wiring, kids differ, as invariant standards do not. Kids who haven't had such experiences need one-on-one conversations with adults who care about them. They need exposure to libraries and classroom libraries filled with enticing books. Kids need to be read to. They need story time. They need jump rope rhymes and nursery rhymes and songs and jingles. They need social interaction using spoken language. They need books that are their possessions, objects of their own. They need to memorize and enact, and so on. They need fun with language generally and with reading in particular. They need the experiences that they never got. And so, the mechanics of learning to read should be only a small part of the whole of a reading program. And reading programs must grok that kids differ as the magic formulae of education deformers and self-proclaimed education pundits do not. However, this series of talks will deal only with the mechanics part of early reading instruction. That in itself is a lot bigger topic than it is recognized generally to be. Permit me to start with an analogy. As a hobby, I make and repair guitars. This is exacting work requiring precise measurement. If the top or soundboard of a guitar is half a millimeter too thin, the wood can easily crack along the grain. If the top is half a millimeter too thick, the guitar will not properly resonate. For a classical guitar soundboard made of Engelmann spruce, the usual material, the ideal thickness is between 1.5 and 2 millimeters, depending on the width of the wood grain. However, experienced luthiers, guitar makers, typically dome their soundboards, adding thickness about half a millimeter around the edges, at the joins, and in the area just around the sound hole to accommodate an inset decorative rosette and to compensate for the weakness introduced by cutting the hole. To measure an object that precisely, one needs a good measuring equipment. To measure around the sound hole, one might use a device like a Starrett micrometer that sells for about $450. It probably goes without saying that one doesn't use an expensive precision tool like that for a purpose for which it was not designed. You could take a close to $500 micrometer and hammer with it, but you wouldn't want to do so, obviously. It wouldn't do the job properly, and you might end up destroying both the work and the tool. But that's just what many reading teachers and English teachers are doing when they teach strategies for reading comprehension and indulge in other fruitless approaches to teaching reading. They are applying astonishingly sophisticated tools, the minds of their students, in ways that they were not designed to work. And in the process, they are doing significant damage. Leaving aside for another set of talks the issues of physical and emotional preparedness, to understand why the default method for teaching reading comprehension now being implemented in our elementary and middle school classrooms fails to work for many students, one has to understand how the internal mechanism for language is designed to work. Linguists, since Chomsky, use the phrase language acquisition device, or LAD, to refer to the innate mechanism hardwired into the human brain for learning spoken language, including vocabulary and grammar. The parts of the brain that carry out this learning, some of them localized and some not, coordinate with other parts of the brain that do pattern recognition for decoding and long-term storage and retrieval of knowledge about the world for recognizing context and reference to form a complex mental tool for comprehending texts. Sadly, some English teachers, reading teachers, and education professors, and many curriculum coordinators, test makers, leaders of textbook companies, and bureaucrats and politicians who mandate state testing of reading typically understand almost nothing of how the internal tools for comprehending a text work. For almost to a person, they know very little of contemporary linguistic and cognitive science, and so instead of basing their instruction and assessment on those sciences, they fall back on unexamined folk ideas established habits of the tribe, and mandate or implement comprehension, instruction, and assessment that can most charitably be described as pre-scientific folk theory and superstition. The internal tool, the language mechanism of the student brain, is not designed to work in the ways in which, quote, reading comprehension specialists, end quote, fielding, quote, reading strategies, end quote, are asking students to do it. Ironically, the person with the doctorate in reading comprehension from an education school is the one most likely to be wedded to pre-scientific strategies-based techniques, pedagogy, and materials, curricula, and assessments. Such people direct reading instruction in our schools, and the result is predictable. Lots of kids who might have been readers but don't typically read on their own because they can't, because for them reading is too difficult to be enjoyable. Let me talk for a moment about the persistence of the pre-scientific. In the past 50 years, we have had dramatic scientific revolutions in both linguistics and in cognitive psychology. We now know a lot about how language and knowledge are acquired, and about how people make sense of texts. And almost none of this contemporary science has made its way into everyday, quotidian instructional techniques and materials. A digression on the history of physics will provide an illuminating contrast to the current state of much of our reading comprehension instruction. In their brilliant and accessible little book, The Evolution of Physics, Albert Einstein and Leopold Enfield describe how Galileo used a thought experiment to overturn the then roughly 1700-year-old Aristotelian notion that objects in motion contain a motive force that is used up until they come to rest. Galileo imagined using oil to make the object travel further. Next, he imagined using a perfect oil that would perfectly reduce the friction acting on the object. The result, Galileo's result, was the idea codified in Newton's first law of motion. Objects don't move until they use up their force. Instead, they persevere indefinitely, that is forever, in uniform motion until they are acted upon by an external force that changes their motion. The Aristotelian notion is entirely intuitive. The Galilean Newtonian notion is quite counterintuitive. However, the Aristotelian notion is false and the Galilean Newtonian one true. Aristotle's was a pre-scientific folk theory of motion. It made sense to people, but it was wrong, and the development of modern technology and science was not possible until it was overthrown. Other folk and pseudoscientific theories of physics and astrophysics have held sway throughout the centuries. The theory that fire is the release during combustion of an element called phlogiston. The theory that light propagates as waves in an invisible medium called the ether that fills space. The theory that heavier objects fall faster than light ones do. The theory that the earth is flat. The theory that the sun travels across the sky. The theory that the earth is at the center of the universe and that planets revolve around it in epicycles, spheres within spheres. All these notions made sense based on people's everyday observations and their intuitive thinking about those observations, and all were absolutely wrong. Now, imagine that you go into a high school in the United States today, pick up an introductory physical science text, and find that it teaches the Aristotelian theory of motion, the phlogiston theory of fire, and the waves through the ether theory of light. Suppose that the space science textbook in that school teaches that a flat Earth sits at the center of the universe and that planets move around it in epicycles. You would be shocked, appalled, scandalized. But of course, this would never happen. Our physics textbooks try to teach elementary, contemporary physics. But walk into almost any K-12 school in the United States today and you will find instructional and assessment techniques and materials that are built upon pre-scientific folk theories of grammar, vocabulary acquisition, and reading comprehension that are completely at odds with our contemporary scientific understandings of these. Walk into teacher training institutions and you will find typically that the pre-scientific folk theories are being taught. Pick up any state or district interim reading assessment and you will find that they were built on these folk theories. Okay, so let's try to sort out that mess. I'll begin by telling you what reading comprehension involves. In order to read a text with comprehension, one needs to be able to, that is, students need to be able to, 1. Interpret automatically, unconsciously, and fluidly the symbols being used. This is the phonics component of decoding. Note that this crucial precursor for reading comprehension requires that the student be able to recognize quickly and without effort, and indeed without conscious rehearsal of the fact that he or she is doing so, the roughly 42 separate sound symbol correspondences of written English. The actual count of the number of sound symbol correspondences is a little higher, but this rough number is sufficient for the purpose of phonics instruction. 2. Students need to be able to parse automatically, unconsciously, and fluidly the morphology and syntax of the sentences, the grammar component of decoding. Morphology is the rule-based combination of minimal, meaningful, or functional word parts or morphemes into words. Syntax is the rule-based arrangement of words and phrases to form well-ordered grammatical statements in a language. In the rest of these talks, when I use the term syntax, I will be referring to syntax proper and to morphology. Sometimes I will mention both explicitly when I think it particularly important that both be considered. Note that this crucial precursor for reading comprehension, grammatical fluency, requires that the student be able to parse quickly and effortlessly, and usually without consciousness that they're doing so, many thousands of syntactic forms. Number 3, the student needs to be able to interpret the meanings of words and phrases based on what they refer to and how they are used in relevant real-world contexts. Note that this crucial element of reading comprehension depends fundamentally on specific related world knowledge in the domain that the text treats. A contemporary philosophy text, for example, might use words like defeasible, propositional calculus, modal operator, zombie, counterfactual, supervenience, indexicality, and GRU. And one will have to know how these words are used in contemporary philosophy and quite a bit about how they are related to one another in order to understand the philosophy text at all. Well, the same thing applies to all texts read by kids. Number 4, the student needs to be able to recognize much of the kairos, or total context of the text, the who, what, where, when, why, and how of its creation, including its genre or type, the concerns of its author, and its literary and rhetorical conventions. Note that this crucial element of reading comprehension depends upon prior experience with and inductive learning about similar extra-textual elements. Inductive learning is the learning from experience, the kind in which we generalize consciously or unconsciously from specific instances. Almost all learning is inductive. Okay, what I'm going to do in this series of talks is look at each of these in turn to learn what science now tells us about them, about each, and how our reading comprehension instruction goes wrong by totally ignoring that science. So we will have sections on automatically interpreting the symbols being used, on parsing the morphology and syntax of the sentences, interpreting the meanings of words and phrases, and recognizing the kairos or context of the text. Please have a look at the rest of the talks in this series if you are interested in learning how not to teach kids to read and how you should do it properly. Please like and subscribe and have a look at the other talks on my channel. Thank you for listening.